Yes, one more time. We are going to do chapter 1 in our new book reading, The Black Pope, A History of the Jesuits by M.F. Cusack. She was a nun. If you don't remember what's that called? The introduction that I had read earlier. Okay, we are in chapter 1. Martin Luther and Ignatius Loyola. Contrast between Luther and Loyola. The birth and early surroundings of Luther and Loyola. The one uplifts the banner of light and spiritual freedom. The other forges new chains for the enslaving of the human race. Let me get a bookmarker thing so I can follow my sentences. Okay. Spiritually and intellectually, and transmits the worst evil of the Dark Ages to posterity. The military career of Loyola, his indifference to pain when his personal vanity was concerned. His severe wound leads to his retirement from active military service. He desires to become famous as a saint, as he can no longer hope to become famous as a soldier. Contrast with Luther, who reads the Bible and desires to bring all to Christ. Loyola consecrates himself to the service of the Virgin Mary and puts on her livery. Luther puts on the whole armor of God. Loyola fasts, flogs himself, and sees visions, but does not find peace. The more he flogs himself and fasts, the more visions he sees. Luther cries aloud, "The just shall live by faith." Superstitions, which Luther combats and Loyola supports. How miracles are made, the ghost of the ironmonger. Loyola cast into the Inquisition, accused of heresy. Spain, the cradle of religious mysticism at this period. Loyola gets into trouble by interfering with ladies of great wealth. He goes to Paris in 1528. He makes disciples, Peter Faber and Francis Xavier. He determines to devote his order to the service of the Pope, takes vows with his disciples in Paris the 15th of August, 1528. Corrupt state of the church at this period. One cause of his success, the Pope eager to find anyone who would restore the confidence of the people to the religious orders. He wins the people by the show of love for poverty, and the rich by accommodating himself to their vices. Opens a home in Rome for the mistresses of the nobles and the ecclesiastics, who had been a public scandal. Wins the ecclesiastical authority by the enforcement of a cruel edict against the Jews. Obtains a bull sanctioning his order in 27th February 1540. How the Jesuits obtained complete control of the noble families in Rome and knew all their secrets. The close of the 15th century witnessed the birth of two children who were destined to make history. Luther was born in 1483. 8 years afterwards, Don Igno Lopez de Raquel was born. How strange the mystery of human life. Who shall answer the cry of the yearning heart to know the unknowable? The one was destined to be the precursor who proclaimed gospel liberty to the enslaved. The other was destined to forge new chains for the souls of men and to bind them with cords of steel. And yet, while in the dawn of life, who can adventure to predict the future of liberator or Jesuit? For Luther, born of a humble family, an unnoticed career would have been anticipated. He might indeed have aspired to the cloister, for it was then the resort of the poorest and the least educated for the community. But Loyola, the descendant of Spanish grandes, a brilliant career in court and tented field would have been little short of a certainty. But when the pages of life came to be unfolded for these two men, how different was the result to the anticipation. The fame of the lowly born Luther has echoed down the stream of time as the champion of religious liberty. And if he was somewhat rude in his mode of denouncing error, his rudeness was as much the outcome of his earnestness and sincerity as of the habits of the due time of the due time. No, I'm sorry. Why am I adding that in there? Forgive me. His rudeness was as much the outcome of his earnestness and sincerity as of the habits of the times in which he lived. As for Ignatius Loyola, he also had his fame and his applause, but his fame has not been the fame of an enlightenment or an enlightener of mankind, or of one who has advanced civil or religious liberty. His applauders have not been those who have loved truth and hated dissimulation. Sad indeed that the once chivalrous and knightly Loyola should have become the founder of an institution which has reduced the practice of deceit to a fine art and taught its members how to conceal and practice evil under a semblance of virtue. A Roman, and not Roman, a European war was imminent, as indeed, when is it not? Just at the moment when Loyola was of age to desire distinction in the field and to uphold the warlike traditions of his family. He ambitioned the rank of general. He was a youth of impetuous desires, and naturally his aspirations lay along the line which the age had glorified. To build cathedrals and to conquer new provinces were the ambitions of the century, until the invention of the printer's noble art had opened the doors of knowledge. Cathedral buildings was left at that period a good deal to the colder blooded north. As for the southern, he has also been more ready for the sword than the pen or the chisel. But the military career of Loyola had scarcely begun ere it had ended. In the year 1521, the town of Pampeluna was besieged by the French, led by André de Foix, Lord of Espar. Loyola commanded the fort and determined to allow the extermination of his little band sooner than yield to the hated French. But Providence decreed that he should fail, and the shattering of his leg by a cannon ball put him hors de combat to one at once and finally. The French general treated the Spanish captain with the usual chivalry of the age and the nation. He sent his own surgeon to attend his wounded friend. He gave him liberty without ransom, and eventually sent him with honor to his father's castle. And here the work of the Society of Jesus practically commenced. The character of the founder of the order manifested itself even in his hours of pain. He showed a grim determination to submit to any suffering which might attain the end he had in view. His leg had contracted during his illness. It must be made the right length, no matter what agony the doing of it occasioned. A projecting bone came in the way of wearing a fashionable attire of the day, and the bone must go. The bone was removed, and the most terrible instruments were applied to the leg to obtain the desired restoration to its normal conditions. But the barbarous surgery of the day could do little to add pain to pain. Loyola endured all his sufferings without obtaining his desire. One thing, however, was certain. His days of chivalry were ended. His work in camp and court was done. The long illness which he had endured with Spartan hardness left its traces on his countenance. He could no longer play the gallant in court or in the castles of his knightly friends. He could no longer do battle for his country. His occupation was gone. His active mind gave him no rest. Though admittedly an uneducated man, it would appear that he could read, and probably his temperament had led him to love the perusal of the romances which were the light literature of his day. He looked for books to pass the time of a long enforced convalescence, and none could be found save some legends of the saints and the legendary life of the Virgin Mary. What mighty effects arise from apparently accidental causes. Probably Laloya saw little difference at first between the romances and the legends, but as he read, he was seized with the idea of devoting himself to the militant service of the church. He could no longer devote himself to the military service of his country. He needed an idolized woman to replace the ladies fair, if not frail, to whom he had done his devour in court and tinted field. So Laloya now offered to the Queen of Heaven the devotion which he had previously offered to the ladies who had been saluted queens of beauty in the court of Spain. If we would read the history of this remarkable man aright, we must study the mental conditions in which he found himself and the customs of the country and the times in which he lived. Instead of placing the colors of his inamorata on his lance or in his corslet and challenging his fellow knights to do battle in her honor, he took the garb which, according to the religious ideas of the time, was the garb most pleasing to the lady whom he now desired to honor with especial veneration. He clothed himself in the rags of a pilgrim. He flogged his body till the blood came. He fasted until he saw visions, and the more he flogged himself, the more visions he saw. The more visions he saw, the more he fasted. It was simply cause and effect. The mind, weakened by the weakened body, was no longer master of his God given intellect. He was guilty of intellectual suicide, for he deliberately deprived himself of his mental powers. No wonder if, in such a state of mind, the idea should have come to him of framing a rule which requires the abnegation of God's best gift to man. A general who was about to engage in an anxious and important campaign would not. Hold on 1 minute. Hold on 1 minute. Okay. Would not dream of preparing himself for it by deliberately weakening his intellectual faculties. Yet this is precisely what the Spanish devotee considered to be necessary for the success of his enterprises. Laloya, once the knight errant, had now become the saint, according to his narrow ideas of sanctity. His relatives expostulated with him in vain. He had read the lives of the saints during his long illness and had determined, with that dogged determination which seems to have been the dominant feature in his character, that if he could not become famed as a knight, he would become famed as a saint. He has accomplished his desire, but how far either he or the world at large has befitted by his ambition, his history will tell. Yet with all this infliction of penance, Laloya was not happy. It is true he had visions which must have gratified his vanity, but the visions gave no peace to his restless soul. On one occasion, he lay for 8 days in a trance of swoon, but his awakening did not find him any happier. He was haunted by demons and distressed by doubts. Probably he believed in his visions, and his demoniacal apparitions were to him realities. It was an age of belief in the marvelous. The priest cannot secure power or influence with the people unless he can show signs or supernatural manifestations. It is needed that these marvels should be genuine, so long as it needed not that these marvels should be genuine, so as long as ever credulous public believed them to be such. It needed not that the miracle worker should be a deliberate impostor. He needed only to believe in himself. It should never be forgotten that the power of the priest rests solely on the credence of the people. The people cry out for a savior, for certainty of heaven, for an assurance of exemption from the terrors of hell. Hence, priestcraft can neither do without hell nor purgatory. Take away both, or either its power is gone. But in order to maintain a belief in the supernatural powers of the priest, there must be some apparently supernatural evidence. Hence, these miracles, not only of the 16th century, but of the 19th. Today, we are told that Saint Winifred has given the power of speech to a woman who had not spoken for at least 2 years, but the case had already been diagnosed by the medical faculty as one of simple hysteria. At the period of which we write, a still more wonderful miracle was reported from Paris. A certain old ironmonger, Estish Mabam, by name, died there, not exactly in the odor of sanctity, but he was devout to the Virgin all the same, or perhaps all the more. It was on the night of the 6th January 1482, when a magnificent bonfire had been commanded. Some boys bethought them that the pallet on which he lay dead would serve to help their fireworks. They accordingly seized it and threw it down in the street. It was then seized by a vagrant who lay down on it, hoping to secure a good night's rest. The boys soon returned with more pillage for the flames, and amazed at what they supposed to be a vision, rushed off with piercing screams declaring that it was the ghost of the ironmonger. This was sufficient to form the groundwork of a stupendous miracle. But on the following day, the pallet was taken in state to the church of St. Opportune, where it remained until the year 1789, and a handsome income was made by the authorities by whom it was exhibited as a proof of the power of the Virgin, whose statue had effected the miracle of exorcising the soul of Mabam, which had hid itself in the straw to trick the devil. Laloya acted according to his lights. His church taught that the doing of certain acts of the bodily mortification would obtain a very high place in heaven for the doer, and that they would be very acceptable to the Virgin if offered in her name. Furthermore, Laloya knew that canonization was the highest honor that the church could bestow, and that the practicing of such mortification was the sure road to canonization. If he could no longer hope to have his name handed down in the annals of his country as a distinguished general, he might obtain the honor, as he did eventually, of having his name handed down by the church as worthy of a place on her altars. We are not writing a life of Ignatius Loyola, hence much of his personal history must be passed over, and only as much related as will show the character of this marvelous man who succeeded in founding an organization which has more than once convulsed Europe by its ambitions. It can scarcely be denied, except by his submissive disciples, that he acted in direct opposition to the plain counsels of Christ, whose name he so ostentatiously assumed. Our Lord declared that his kingdom was not of this world, and by his manner of life showed that the things of time and sense were but trifles, whose only importance might be found in the use which might be made of them for the eternal interest of the users. The Jesuits, on the contrary, has always been clamorous for power and wealth, and has in consequence occupied himself both individually and collectively with the rich rather than with the poor. Apparently, Laloya became tired of his life of self-mortification, for we find that he set out for Palestine by way of Rome in the year 1523. To follow his various wanderings during the next few years would be impossible and is not necessary. Arrived at Jerusalem, where the Franciscan fathers had held full spiritual authority, he thought he might at once commence his self-imposed mission of converting the heathen. But there were two invincible difficulties in his way: his culpable ignorance of the commonest elements of the Christianity which he proposed to teach, and his entire ignorance of the language of those whom he wished to convert. It was in vain that he assured the provincial of the Franciscans that a miracle would be worked in his behalf. The provincial did not believe in such miracles. Possibly also he may have accurately gauged the character of the ex-Spanish grande and feared a troublesome, even if ignorant, rival. The result, however, whatever may have been the cause, was that Loloya at last realized that he was absolutely ignorant even of the commonest elements of theology or literature, and with characteristic let's see, impetuosity, he set about acquiring the knowledge which he needed. It is indeed difficult to determine whether Loloya most abounded in self confidence or in ignorance of his deficiencies. For 2 weary years, Loloya sat in a grammar school with mere boys and subjected himself to their ridicule and his master's reproaches with the same grim determination which he had borne the torturing of his limbs when the object to be attained was the gratification of vanity. His submission to torture from such low motives is passed over lightly in the Jesuit schools and novities, while the humiliation he suffered in the pursuit of learning is held up as a model which cannot be excelled. In the year 1526, he proceeded to Alcala, where the famous Cardinal Ximenes had founded a school, and here he combined his favorite pursuit of begging and preaching with the study of theology and logic. But he soon abandoned the latter as he found it too difficult for his limited intelligence. All the same, or perhaps all the more, he gained notice and attained one object which was of supreme moment. He knew that he could not carry out his projects single handed, so he left no effort unused to attract young men, whom he hoped would eventually join him. He succeeded in persuading 3 youths to unite with him in preaching. They knew little, if anything, more than their master, but they all agreed to wear a singular garment, which at least had the advantage of marking them out as something apart from the common herd. And they also succeeded in arousing the jealousy of the priests and monks of Akala. Rome boasts not a little of her unity of doctrine, though at least twice in each past century she has changed her creeds on points of vital importance. Rome boasts of her unity in good works, yet every life of her canonized saints gives ample evidence how the saints persecuted each other with an acrimony which those to whom they preached never attained to their secular conflicts. Loloya was now denounced to the Inquisition by his jealous compatriots and religious brethren. It was needful, of course, to give some appearance of justice to the charge, and the charge was a remarkable one, in view of the mystical character of the teaching which he eventually established. He was cast into the prison of the Inquisition on the charge of being one of the Alumbrados or Illuminati. The origin of this sect or school of philosophy is shrouded in mystery. It is, however, worthy of note that there is a very curious connection between the direction given by Ignatius Loyola in his famous, quote, spiritual exercises, unquote, and the directions which were given to the Buddhist novice on his initiation into the higher mysteries of that creed. And the Alumbrados or Illuminati were of distinctively Buddhist origin. Von Hammer, in his History of the Assassins, a branch of development of the Illuminati, points out singular parallels between the teaching of Loloya and the Assassins. Nor can it be said that drawing attention to this parallelism is a mere Protestant prejudice, since the first charge was made by the priests of Alcala and in the very lifetime of the founder of the Jesuits. The whole subject is one which has hardly met with the consideration which it deserves, and is of grave importance in view of the recently restored power of the Jesuits in nearly every European country. Of all Christian kingdoms, Spain has been the most given to a mysticism, of which Saint Teresa and Saint John of the Cross are eminent examples. But whether the temperament in which the mysticism was engendered and perfected was the result of the climatic conditions or of racial development, we do not profess to decide. One thing, however, is certain, that the peculiar forms of devotional practices closely resembled the initiatory stages of the Buddhism. Wow, I never knew that. The word assassin is actually derived from the word hashishin, hashishin, which is again derived from hashish, the Eastern intoxicant. I think that's marijuana, but I'm not positive. Marijuana. I don't know. The assassins ceased to be a recognized body after the Crusades, but their doctrines and some, at least, of their practices long survived in Spain against the herbs or natives of Barbary. This accusation against Ignatius Loyola of being connected with the Illuminati stopped his career for the time in Alcala. He was acquitted of heresy, but severely condemned for his theological ignorance, and duly warned by the inquisitor that he preached any longer while so ignorant of even the elements of religion, he would meet with severe punishment. He was also obliged to lay aside his eccentric dress and to betake himself to another university. It may be noticed here that the peculiar teaching and practices which have again and again formed the ground of the expulsion of the Jesuits by Roman Catholics from Roman Catholic countries had their first development in the lifetime of Loyola. For example, he had obtained such influence over two ladies of immense wealth in Akola that he induced them to leave their homes and to go forth on a begging expedition for the purpose of perfecting themselves in humility. The relatives of these ladies did not view the interference of Loyola in a favorable light, and he was again thrown into prison until his fair disciples, weary of the penance he had imposed on them, returned to their friends and resumed their place in society. Ignatius Loyola arrived in Paris in the early spring of 1528. He was accompanied by some students who had been converted to his views. His object in going to the French capital was to find a place where he could pursue his studies unobserved and develop his plans without ecclesiastical interference. He had made the discovery, often made before and since his time, that there is no place so safe as a crowd for those who, for any reason, wish to pass unnoticed. The Society of Jesus was practically founded in Paris. Ignatius managed so far to satisfy his preceptors, as to be allowed to take the degree of bachelor and eventually of master of arts in the College of St. Barbe. He had yet to perfect himself in theology, a matter no means so easy as might be supposed. The complicated theology of the Roman Catholic Church, which differs so much from the simplicity of the gospel, was the great hindrance to the success of the founder of the Jesuits. Ignatius was wise enough to know that he could not expect his disciples to render him the spiritual homage which he required if he himself was ignorant of the science of which they naturally expected him to be a master. But there are a few things, good or bad, which cannot be accomplished by perseverance. Ignatius found the support which his nascent order sorely needed from unsuspected sources. He was joined by men who, though far his superiors in intellect, and we might add in common sense, were fascinated by his schemes. Pierre Lefebvre, known better as Peter Faber, a youth full of genius and imagination, became one of his disciples, and at this time also he was joined by the future glory of the order, Francis Xavier of Navarre. Xavier was then professor at the College of Beauvais and had every reason to expect the highest ecclesiastical advancement as well from his social position as from his intellectual attainments. As both Faber and Xavier were held in very high estimation in the universities of Paris, their championship of Ignatius Loyola gave the tone to the order which it needed, without which it would probably have failed completely. The story of the conversion of Saint Francis Xavier has been variously given, and at the present day it is impossible to decide between conflicting authorities. The fact that Ignatius gained this prize is the only point of importance. Strange mystery of human life. In latter times, there was no place where the Jesuits were so hotly denounced and so abhorred as in Paris. Yet, this was the cradle of the order. Ignatius had now 7 disciples, some of whom at least were of immense benefit to the new order, if indeed his organization deserved the name. He had no approbation except his own. So far, the dignitaries of the church whom he had approached had dismissed him with contempt or imprisoned him for his eccentricities and ignorance. But it seemed as if no opposition could discourage this man of iron will. On the 15th of August, 1534, Ignatius, with his 7 followers, met in the crypts of a sanctuary at Montmartre and took their vows without permission of priest or prelate. Of the 7 who had thrown in their lot with Ignatius, only one was a priest. This was Father Peter Faber. He said Mass for the rest and gave them the mutilated sacrament of the Church of Rome. Ignatius, in his character of self-appointed superior, was the first to take the vows and swore on the Gospels to lead a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The rest followed his example, and thus was established an institution, which, as we shall see from undisputable evidence, has done more than any other so-called religious order to ruin the peace of families, to check the growth of human progress, and to enslave the souls of men. And yet all this was done in the name of religion. Well, might we paraphrase a well-known aphorism and exclaim, O religion, what crime have been committed in thy name? Spain, having always been under the rule of the priesthood, has always been the country of darkness, social and religious. The Spaniard, easily amused with rude pastimes and supplied by his marvelous climate with all that he needed for food and clothing, concerned himself but little about the rest of the world. Ignatius had not heard of the course of events in Germany, nor of the stupendous religious movements which had even then begun. To him, with his narrow temperament and his stubborn will, it must have come as a tremendous shock when he learned for the first time that men existed who were so daring, or as he would have deemed it, so blasphemous, as to have condemned the Pope and rejected his authority. But France, always in the advance guard of information, if not of knowledge, resounded that the clash of opinions was fully alive, whatever side individuals might take as to the tremendous importance of this first serious blow to the spiritual power of the papacy. Ignatius had already intended to devote his order in some special manner to the advancement and support of the papal power, and here was a new and to him all-powerful motive for renewed fealty and effort. Hence, when taking his vows, he declared it to be his special intention to offer himself and his followers for the advancement and protection of the Church of Rome, and above all, to the personal service of the Pope. He concluded his oath with the words which have since become the watchword of the order. Would they had, let's see, now I probably can't pronounce this stuff, but let's see. Would that they had been its guiding principle instead of being used as a means of throwing a glamour of apparent piety over what is little better than a deliberate system of skillfully organized duplicity. Ad majorum Dei gloriam. The words with which Ignatius ended his vow was re-echoed by each of his 7 disciples. To this has been added the words IHS. These initials signifying Jesus hominum salvator, Jesus, the Savior of mankind. And yet, even while these words, so true and so scriptural, fell from the lips of the Spanish mystic, he was doing all that mortal man could do, let us hope unconsciously, to give the glory to another which he professed himself so desirous of giving to God alone. So IHS. The day which he chose for the commencement of his order was the feast of Assumption of the Virgin Mary. It is true that there is not even one particle of proof of this supposed assumption, but what matter? Rome has spoken. Reason is no longer to be guide of human life. It has now, no, it was not until many centuries had passed that Rome established this festival authoritatively. The motive of the festival is not far to seek. It is self evident that unless Mary was in heaven, she could not perform all the miracles that are attributed to her intercession. It is also self evident that unless she had a place there almost equal to that of God, she could not exercise the omnipotence with which she is credited, hence the necessity of establishing a festival which would assume the people not only was Mary throned in heaven, but that she held the very highest place in the celestial kingdom. The legend of the Assumption of Mary was not even the least historical, has not the least historical foundation, but this matters very little to an infallible church whose dictates must be accepted at the peril of the eternal salvation of the unbeliever. Ignatius had now actually commenced his order, but two very important matters had been neglected. He had neither obtained the preliminary permission of a bishop nor the final approbation of a pope. This did not concern him much, so assured was he of his own importance, but some of his followers were wiser. Ignatius now saw that the only way in which he could protect himself from the attacks of jealous religious and angry priests was to become a priest himself as soon as possible. But his health broke down again under the renewal of self-inflicted sufferings. According to his idea of religion, Christ could not save him without the help of Mary, else why take so much trouble to secure the patronage of Mary? Nor could even Mary save him without his own self-inflicted suffering, else why had he need again and again to bring himself almost to the grave by fasts and vigils and floggings? Ignatius was once more compelled to seek a southern clime and left Paris in the spring of 1535. He took care, however, to keep his little band together by appointing Peter Faber superior, arranging that all should meet him in Venice when their theological course should have been completed. When the brothers reunited, according to this arrangement, their number had increased. For Ignatius brought a disciple with him, and the brothers brought 3 promising new members from Paris. It may seem strange to say it, but it is nevertheless true that one cause of the extraordinary success of the Jesuits was the awful corruption of the Church of Rome. Rome has always claimed temporal power and desired to rule over the kings and princes of the earth. In order to accomplish this end, she has left no means unused to obtain wealth and to influence politicians. No matter what may be said of vows of poverty, if any body of men abound in wealth, they are individually as well as collectively rich, and all the evils divinely predicted of those who heap up to themselves riches at once become their portion. Again and again, the Church of Rome has been all but shipwrecked by those of her sons who, living in apparent conformity to the counsels of the gospel, have actually set those counsels at defiance. It needs scarcely to point to the lives of the saints collectively for proof of this statement, but one particular instance may be given. Saint Francis of Assisi, one of the saints to whom Rome points those outside her fold, which unbounded confidence commenced his career of evangelization with the strongest denunciation of priests of his day. With a touch of romance inseparable, one had almost said happily, from southern temperaments, he devoted himself to his lady and mistress, poverty. When imploring the blessing of the Pope for his new order, he told his vision in which he believed himself divinely appointed to save the church from destruction by his renewal of gospel teaching, which, according to this vision, had been well nigh abandoned. Ignatius, Francis, and almost every saint in the Roman calendar have their have based their claim of the necessity of a new order in the church on the evident corruption into which it had fallen, despite the efforts of those who had preceded them in the path of reform. The people heard them gladly. This was the secret of their success. The people who suffer so much on earth and who hope for so much in heaven. The people hear gladly what promises to them, either here or hereafter, something better than their life in this world. Even those who, from temperament or piety, envy the rich the least, are willing to hear of poverty which they are assured shall purchase wealth, where alone wealth shall be abiding, of humiliation which shall secure honor, where honor will be everlasting. We do not say that Ignatius or Francis or others who aspired to be the spiritual rulers of their people deliberately played the role of deceivers when they adapted themselves to the needs and desires of the poor, but they did so adapt themselves in a fact which cannot be questioned. As efforts of Ignatius had been so far successful, he won the toleration, if not the admiration, of his kinfolk. It is wonderful how success ennobles a cause. He was a rising man, and his world appreciated him accordingly. But Ignatius was either too wise or too sincere in his idea of Christian poverty to accept from his own family the hospitality they now offered. He won the hearts of the people, and after all, it is the people who make success, by refusing to live the life of the noble and choosing the life of the poor. He stooped to conquer. If he had then thrown in his lot with the rich and the noble, the poor would have abandoned him. But by winning the applause of the people, he gained the ear of the rich. And he and his followers were to be found with the sick and the leper, and this was sufficient to win for him the mighty voice of the populace. Ah, I understand. Okay. Ignatius Loyola was gifted with the worldly wisdom which has preeminently characterized his order. He found means to win over Carfa, afterwards Pope Paul IV, and then Archbishop of Feti. Carfa gave him letters of recommendation to the Pope, of which Ignatius made Xavier, Leans, and Faber the bearers. They were welcomed far more warmly than could have been expected. They received the papal blessing and permission for the ordination of all those who had not yet been ordained in consequence of their ignorance of theology. But what cannot a pope do? Further, the Pope gave a considerable sum of money towards the expenses of the purposed mission to Palestine. But once more, the plans of ex-Chevalier were defeated by circumstances. A war had broken out between the Phoenician Republic and the Ottoman powers, and traveling was out of the question. Again, Ignatius gave himself and his followers to the congenial occupation of preaching. They ascended rude platforms with much noise and gesticulation, invited men to what they called repentance. As the brothers were, for the most part, absolutely ignorant of the language of the country, the work was carried on principally by shouts and gesticulations. Noise always attracts, if it does not impress, a multitude, and it is said that this preaching, if such it could be called, was not without effect.
The nurse will be here in about half an hour.
Okay.
I already put him in the room.
Okay. Ignatius now began again to make arrangements for the more specific settlement of his order. He had many difficulties, but difficulties only stimulated him to further efforts. There were some men of considerable ability as well as more than ordinary worldly wisdom amongst his followers, and let me see. And they saw clearly that in order to succeed, they must offer the Pope and the world something entirely new. It was now finally decided that the order should exist only for the service of the Pope and under his immediate direction for the service of the Church. But it is not to be supposed that the other religious orders, the principal of which were then the Domitians and the Franciscans, were willing to allow a new body of men to deprive them of their prestige or prerequisites. These orders raised a mighty outcry, and as it was always safe to show one's zeal by accusing others of heresy, the accusation was made that Ignatius and his flowers, I don't know why it says flowers, were far from being what they professed to be, and that they were actually in league with the reformers now so active in Germany. The charge was obviously absurd, but such is human credulity, and that it often happens, and more absurd the slander, the more readily it is believed. But Ignatius again triumphed, and triumphed finally. There was a terrible famine in Rome at this time, and this afforded another opportunity for the advancement of his order. Ignatius, always alive to the tone of public opinion, saw and used his opportunity. He convinced the rich of his piety by his fervor appeals for money for the poor, and he convinced the poor of his regard for their interests by bestowing on them at least some of the wealth which he obtained from the rich. He also obtained great honor from all classes for his zeal for the conversion of the Jews. His method was not original. He obtained a decree from Pope Paul III, then reigning, that the Jews should not be allowed the services of a physician, no matter how serious might be their danger, unless they first accepted the ministrations of a priest. This mode of obtaining conversions proved very efficacious, and Ignatius was honored accordingly. Thus, the Society of Jesus inaugurated its career of unchristian diplomacy. Ignatius knew perfectly that such conversions were writ in sand. The next move of the diplomatic Jesuit was to secure the influence of the ladies of Rome. That was not difficult. His order was new, and he must have been gifted with such special fascination of manner which his knightly training had enhanced. We have already spoken of the terrible state of society at this period, and naturally, Rome being the chief ecclesiastical city, the corruption was greatest at the fountainhead. Priests and people were alike sunk in the deepest debauchery. Women of nameless character had even the churches their haunt, and the place where they exhibited their uh, meritorious charms. Luther was calling attention with trumpet tongue to the fearful condition of the city where the Pope reigned supreme as temporal as well as spiritual king. If he tolerated, and by tolerating encouraged such evils, how could the church be called holy? Paul III was aroused at last. He assembled his cardinals, but the only remedy which they could suggest was to drive all the women of doubtful character out of Rome. And obviously, it was much easier to suggest this remedy than to apply it. But here again, Ignatius saw his opportunity and came to the rescue. He secured large sums of money from ladies of rank whose own husbands and confessors had been probably the chief sources of the downfall of these unhappy women. And with this in hand, he proceeded to establish a home for all whom he could induce to enter it. His success was great indeed, but his plans were laid with his usual consummate skill. He carefully avoided anything that might seem degrading to these unfortunate women. He called the house which he had prepared for them a home and made it such. There was no restrictions and no vows. The house was soon filled with penitents, or those who at least appeared to be such. Many, no doubt, were utterly weary of their miserable life and thankful to find a refuge could live without cost to themselves and in comparative luxury. Ignatius got the credit of having accomplished a wonderful reform and was honored accordingly. In August 1539, Ignatius asked the approbation of the Pope for the rules of his new order. It is the rule in the Roman Catholic Church when anyone desires to found a new religious order that they should first obtain the permission of their immediate ecclesiastical superior. This approval having been obtained, the work goes on tentatively for a time. Eventually, if it has shown good prospect of success, it is approved by the Pope. It need scarcely be said that all this cannot be accomplished without a very large expenditure of money in order to obtain the goodwill of the cardinals and other officials, not, of course, as a bribe, but for expenses. The expenses are very considerable, but then success is secured in proportion to the outlay. Further, it is a curious fact that Rome never canonizes a saint. Silly dogs. Hold on 1 minute. Okay. Further, it is a curious fact that Rome never canonizes a saint without an immense disbursement on the part of those who are interested. Some saintly personages remained uncanonized because either their relatives or their order had not sufficient capital to invest in the necessary preliminaries. A curious question therefore arises as to the precise value of the canonization of saints and how far their power in heaven is proportioned to the honors paid to them on earth. Nor can it be said that this is a mere Protestant calumny. It is a Roman Catholic fact. The Roman Catholic Church teaches that masses are the one great means of delivering souls from purgatory. Now, masses either are or are not necessary to obtain this important end. If they are necessary, why is it that the poor who have no money cannot have masses, while the more or less wicked rich have thousands of masses and ought to escape from their penal abode at once? When the Pope had read the documents containing the rules of the new order, he exclaimed, Digitus de hec est. Yet another Pope, not so many centuries later, condemned the whole scheme as an infamy and practically the handiwork of the devil, which infallible Pope was the true prophet. But Loyola was by no means satisfied with a mere verbal approbation. Words marry words, he cried. Words may be denied and explained away. He therefore bent all his energies to secure a written approbation. After some dispute and difficulty, and after considerable opposition from at least one of the cardinals who were appointed to investigate the matter, Ignatius obtained his desire. On the 27th of September, 1540, Pope Paul III issued a special bull commencing Regimini Allentis Ecclesiae, in which he established the order henceforth known as the Jesuits. There were two reasons why this order was established with so little difficulty. In the first place, the German reformers were already winning souls from the forms and ceremonies of the church to the eternal freedom of the gospel. The cardinals and Roman theologians were not without fear lest the whole fabric should fall to the ground. They are always quite as much politicians as prelates, and were, as Roman cardinals always are, very keen for their things of this world and very wise in their generation. Here were men whose very raison d'etre was to save the church from the overwhelming danger with which it was threatened, and who by no means blinded themselves to that danger. One of the principal sources of danger was the dissolute habits of the religious orders. These men promised to live chaste and holy lives so that their example could be pointed out to detractors. But there was another and a very powerful motive for this ready acquiescence. It will be remembered that Ignatius had provided a house for refuge for such of the courtesans of Rome and the neighborhood as chose to avail themselves of it. These women were by no means the offscouring of the populace. Many of them were cast off mistresses of ecclesiastical dignitaries and nobles. The Jesuit fathers were, of course, their confessors. Need it be said that these confessors knew the private history of hundreds, if not thousands, of prelates and princes, and that men who dared not have their secret lives exposed were very prompt to serve those who, if opposed, would soon find very pious reasons for exposing them. We have not space here, nor is it necessary to give the statutes of the society at length. We shall only call attention to one or two important points. We then propose to glance for a moment at the work which was being accomplished at this very time by Luther and his followers. While Ignatius was calling on his disciples to place themselves under the banner of Mary, Luther was proclaiming in stentorian tones that Christ alone can save us and that the just shall live by faith. Look not to saint or angel, to man or woman for your salvation. Look to Christ and to Christ alone. Do not believe in churches which become corrupt by the weight of their inherent fallibility. Look to Christ, the rock and foundation stone of the true church, and he will never fail you. Ignatius demanded an abject and degrading obedience from his followers. Luther would have the obedience to none but to Christ, his master. The chief obligations of the rule Ignatius are easily distinguished. His rule has not changed with changing times of circumstances as the rules of other orders have done. This period of European history was a transition period for religious orders, and Ignatius saw his opportunity. The religious orders, which had suited the manner of life in previous centuries, became by degrees less and less fitting for advancing civilization. Men had begun to think, men had begun as a necessary consequence to criticize. They no longer took their opinions from a dominant priesthood as a child takes its mother's milk. They asked, was this or that regulation best for the general good? Was this or that doctrine consonant with reason? The question came to be openly asked by many. What has Christ said? It was no longer universally asked, what has Rome said? Rome, while declaring herself infallible and unchangeable, has proved her fallibility by many changes and her mutability by alterations, both in creed and discipline of the most important character. For example, she was quietly, but nonetheless completely, changed the whole character of her religious institutions in order to accommodate herself to the times. The establishment of the Jesuits was her first departure in this direction. The world moved, and the church moved with the world. Changes were rife everywhere, and the heads of the church found their own special interests would be seriously imperiled if they did not move also. But this by no means implied that the church encouraged the march of intellect. The modifications which were made did not allow more freedom, they simply changed the form of restraint. New bonds were forged to suit new times. The religious orders had lost all credit with the people. As long as they observed their primitive rule and lived in poverty, which they vowed to observe, it was all very well, at least in the eyes of the poor. They were pleased and consoled to see that poverty was honored as a religious virtue. If practicing poverty could be the means of saving the soul of the friar, it must also benefit the serf. But when the friar ceased to practice poverty or even to show much respect for it, all was changed. And when the friar who vowed temperance was often seen in condition which would have been punished with severity if his cloth had not protected him, the poor man was not slow to denounce the injustice. Further, the friar was vowed to chastity, and here also he failed, till at last ribald songs were sung or said, which held men up to public scorn, and not without cause, who had once been revered as the angels of the earth. The friars, as a class, were ignorant and far too secure in their own estimation of their position to trouble themselves about learning. But when men began to think, they expected to be helped by those to whom they once looked up as the sole depositors of learning. And when they failed to respect was but when they failed, respect was lost and doubt began. Wandering friars who neither taught nor prayed soon became of little account. The enclosed monasteries had decreased in numbers, and the popes no longer encouraged them. It needed new rules and a new form of so called religious life for the new conditions of society. Ignatius had realized these new conditions and established new rules. The new rules declared that the propagation of the faith and promulgation of Christianity, which in that age meant the same thing, were to be primary objects of the Jesuits. The methods by which they were to be carried out were preaching, hearing confessions, and educating the young. An admirable program for the end in view. The young were to be trained to believe that in the church and in the church alone, salvation was to be found. At an impressionable age, they naturally became as wax in the hands of the superiors, and provided they did not revolt in afterlife, would remain the humble servants of their early teachers. But that the Jesuit pupil did revolt, he shall see eventually. We shall see eventually. A boy may be made to believe while he is a boy that he will fulfill the high destinies of manhood by continuing this submission. But when he arrives at man's estate, he wants something more than mere assertion before he will be ready to place all the affairs of life under clerical control. The control which the confessional gave to the Jesuits will be considered elsewhere. Ignatius might have established his colleges and educated youth in vain if he had not made plans fraught with a marvelous enforcing wisdom for retaining the prizes which he had secured. The iniquities of the confessional have been justly made again and again the subject of public exposure and denunciation. But the direction which is given in the confessional and its far reaching results is a subject which deserves more attention than it has received. To the consideration of this point, we shall return later. In the meantime, let us glance at the work of the Reformation. Luther and Loyola both visit Rome, but with different results. When Loyola commences his career of human policy and craft, he uses the sins and follies of his fellow men and women for his own advancement. Luther has but one thought: the greater glory of God and the advancement of his kingdom. He needed not to frame rules or compose spiritual exercises to court cardinals or fallen women. His rule was the Bible, God's character of eternal life, and his spiritual exercise was prayer to the one and only mediator between God and man. And that completes chapter 1 with just one little small interruption by those crazy dogs. And that's it. Praise God, we did it. All right, brothers and sisters, keep your eyes on Jesus, your nose in the book, which is the Word of God, and embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. I love you all so very much. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.